going to do tonight is strictly from the archives of my family and many of the families of the Orcutt area. But I got to tell you in all truthfulness, I started this project out in the year 1977 when I was asked by my boss at Unical, which is just down the street here a little ways at 201 South Broadway, he was asked to put on a presentation about the history of the oil fields of this area. Well, he didn't want to do that, so he come to my office and said, Darwin, you've been around here longer than anybody, so this is your assignment. So from those meager beginnings, by the way, he told me 3 days before the presentation, so I had a lot of time to prepare. But since that time, I have embellished on it, if you will, and I have gotten a lot of material from a lot of people that I have spoke before, and I hope you find it somewhat educational, perhaps in a little bit entertaining. But we're going to cover, in the next few minutes, we're going to cover about 1,000 years of history in this part of the country. To start off with, the first thing that I tried to do in this part of the world to find out what the first attempt was by mankind to use the natural resources of oil that we now know are here for his improvement of his lifestyle. And of course, of all of you, I wonder how many of you here have been in Orcutt for more than 50 years. Is there anybody? Ooh, okay. Well, I've been here 65, 67 years. So from those meager beginnings, I put this story together from my family and other families. But getting back to what was the first person that was actually using oil to improve their lifestyle in this part of the world, of course, as the fourth grader in Orcutt anyway, we learned all about the Native Americans. And of course, the Oak Grove people were the first, and the Cantalinos, and then the Shumash. But we found that in the year 855, we know they were building tomolos, or canoes, using oil as a process for communication, but also for travel up and down this coast. The most important thing that they did along this coastline was near what we call Carpinteria, California. Now we know that Carpinteria stands for the carpenters, but what the Native Americans were doing at that point along our coastline was taking the timber out of the backcountry, the pine, if you will, out of the Figueroas, the Santa Ynez's, out of the Sespe, bringing it down to the coastline and actually physically hewing it into not round logs. They would hew it into timbers, making it into planks. They would dowel and peg or bind these with leather or with material of grasses, bind them together, but the important thing that they did was actually physically line the inside of these tomolos with tar, and it made them a very, very seaworthy vessel. If you want to see one, you can go down to Santa Barbara. You can see it also at the Museum of Natural History in the basement of the courthouse, or at Carpinteria at the state park. At the state park in Carpinteria, there are two large oil seeps right where they built them, and that was their material that they used for doing this. They were about 26, 27 feet long, weighed about 350 pounds, would transport about 4,000 pounds of goods and services. So the Indians of Point Mugu, Los Angeles area, the Channel Islands, were actually trading with the Indians of Pismo and to the north of us and all along the coastline. Well, how do we know some of these things? Well, the first person that came into this part of the country was probably, that we have any records, and they're in Santa Barbara at the Mission, was of course in 1543, and 42 I should say, in 1543 he was here for a full year, was Cabrillo. Cabrillo came into this part of the world, and he was met many leagues out to sea by these people in these canoes. Now he thought he had the very best of sailing vessels and the technology of the time, but lo and behold, he was met by these people coming out to meet him. As soon as his sail come over the top, matter of fact, I was just reading a story yesterday, they called it the wooden ship with a cloud on it. That's what the Indians called it, because they had never seen a ship that could go under its own power, and they were still using paddles or sticks to propel themselves through the water. But nonetheless, they met old Cabrillo out to sea. The next one was there was another one. In 1579, Colonel Drake pulled into the port at what is now the University of California, Santa Barbara, what they call the slough, and mended his ship, and he also, in his diaries, talks about this. But also in 1602, when Juan Sebastian Vizcaino came to this part of the country, he actually physically took one of these boats and took some of the builders and took them back to Spain because he thought the technology was superb, and he wanted to show the people of that nation, of his home country, what these people were being done. This is all very well written and documented in Santa Barbara if you take the time to look at it. So we knew that man was using the oil of this part of the country to better himself. Now, how were they doing this? Well, along the coastline of Santa Barbara County and on the inland side, there are over 3,000 oil seeps inland and over 3,000 oil seeps just along the coastline of Santa Barbara alone. Now, most of us say, well, that sounds rather weird. Well, when we go to the beach, we say, well, that damned oil company, out there, we get the oil on our feet. But most of these substances are natural occurring substances that come from these oil seeps. One of the other people, the next thing that would happen was the trip of Portola when he came down the coastline, or came up the coastline, I should say, starting at the border of Mexico and going to San Francisco to establish presidios and various things for the Spanish government. When he came up this coastline, matter of fact, he crossed here on September the 23rd, 1769. He was in the Orcutt area right off for a little ways from where we now sit. But when he went along here, he found 15 villages, of which there were about 15,000 people in the 15 villages, another total on the Santa Cruz, San Miguel, Santa Rosa Islands, bringing the total up to about 29 villages, and all of these villages had 3 or 4 of these boats that I talk about in it, and were trading goods and services back and forth through and using the oil as a method for improving the boat's capability. But one of the points that he stopped at was just a little ways from where we sit, was called Punta de Laguna, which was Rosario Corletti's ranch, if you remember her at all in this part of the country. And it was the soldiers that were with him called the place Largo de las Indias, the Indian Lake. And the soldiers, he called it that, and the soldiers didn't like that, and they called it La Graciosa, the gracious or the beautiful. And so that name stuck, and it still is prevalent in some of the things we do here today. Well, we'll get away from that. What was the next big thing to happen? Well, a guy by the name of Captain Cook, and of course we all know from our history about him, his diarist and his navigator was a guy by the name of George Vancouver. And old George and him sailed around Point Conception in 1793 and came into this coastline, and they said the stench of bitumen, is the way they pronounced it, oil or asphaltum, was very prevalent. And when they come into Santa Barbara and into that part of the world, and they sent a work party ashore for water and goods and services, if you will, they became heavily encrusted with oil in the breakers and in the water. They said that the oil on the water was all the way from a rainbow all the way up to a pad, up to an inch in thick. Now, man, that's a lot of oil. And they claimed that it was from the Channel Islands to the mainland, from Point Conception and on down the coastline. Well, Union Oil hadn't drilled in this part of the world. We hadn't had an oil spill. Now, how in the world did this happen to occur? Well, the next clue that may be a part of this came in the year 1812. And for any of you that are historians and know a little bit about the year of 1812, it was the year of the earthquakes. It was not only here, it was on the East Coast, the Mississippi Valley, the Ring of Fire around Japan, and all were very, very active that year. And one that happened right here where we sit here today started in May of 1812, and there were over 100 severe earthquakes from that time, building up to a crescendo on December the 21st of 1812. One hit here with a 10 on the Rosell scale, which doesn't mean anything to me either, but converted to the Richter scale would be about an 8.3. It's centered someplace halfway between Lompoc, what is now Lompoc, California, and San Miguel Island, is what they say had occurred. I have to take their word for it. But it brought a tidal wave. For 23 days they had tidal waves in the harbor at Santa Barbara. It washed boats up on the Palisades at Goleta. It came up, the tidal waves came all the way up and around the Presidio, which is about about halfway up State Street, roughly. And so it was one that raged to have it. But what happened? All of the oil seeps that I just talked about a few seconds ago began to evolve and give up their materials. The smell of stench of hydrogen sulfide, the rotten egg smell was very, very prevalent, and the breakers and the waves and the islands also again became heavily laden with oil. So perhaps what George Vancouver seen and what Captain Cook seen was a result of an earthquake. Nobody knows because nobody was here to record it. But the earthquake of 1812 is very prevalent. I'm going to tell you another story when we get into the photographs about that earthquake of 1812. Okay, what was the next big thing that was going to happen? Well, not much happened in the way of oil development in the next few years, but of course one thing was going to happen that was going to put this place on the map, and that was the year 1849. We all know what happened in California in 1849, the gold rush, money. People came from all over. One of the people that came to this part of the country to make his fortune in the gold was a guy by the name of George Gilbert. Now, old George Gilbert was a whale oil salesman out of Boston. He knew everything there was to know about oil and how to market it and how to render it and the whole 9 yards. So he thought if he could come to San Francisco, California, he could probably make his fortune in selling oil to the miners. Well, he got out here. Lo and behold, the oil business as far as whaling was concerned was well underway. Much to his disgust, he purchased a horse and he started to trek down the coastline of California. Well, every place he came, like in the Salinas Valley near Edna, California, the Salinas River, Pismo, which Pismo, by the way, stands for oil in Indian. It's Pisma, Pismu. It never was spelled Pismo, but it also means in Catalino, it means the oil or the tar. Edna, California, the Santa Maria River, La Brea, the Sespe, and which is also another word for oil. La Brea is another word for tar. And all of this country, he found these oil seeps, and he found them very, very active. This is old George Gilbert. And at one near Ojai, California, he actually found a gentleman by the name of William C. Dryden, who was a circuit judge, one of the first in California. He found him digging holes alongside these oil seeps. Now, old Judge Dryden, he didn't know a darn thing about oil, but he knew about coal, and he felt that if he dug alongside of an oil seep, he would get down to some hard material, and it would be coal, and he could do something with it. Well, he didn't realize what he had there. But on down the coastline he went, and he went to Mission San Fernando in the southern part of Ventura County, and there he found Andres Pico, a general from the War of 1812, retired, and he was actually physically lighting the lamps of the mission. The very first time that we can find that anybody was using oil to light lamps in the state of California, that is, was Andres Pico in 1854 at the mission, San Fernando Mission. What he was doing was actually going to an oil seep, gathering the oil and putting it in a lamp and burning it. Well, this was something that George Gilbert understood a little bit about. So he come back up, and alongside of the oil seep that old Colonel Dryden was digging a hole, it was actually physically flowing into the Santa Clara River, Santa Clara River and down to the ocean. It was just all kinds of oil. He set up shop, and with a guy by the name of M.C. Morale, who was a druggist in what is now Ventura, California, they set up what they called a refinery. Now, what they were doing was actually just taking the sticks and the lizards and the bugs out of it and the dirt, putting it in bottles, and they were selling it all the way from snake oil, for a medicine, for croup, for putting on your chest. There's quite a prolific anyway, but also for axle grease, for tar, for sealing roofs, for all kinds of things, and for lamp oil. They were actually making lamp oil. Well, they got so goddamn good at this that Mr. Gilbert actually bottled some of this material and put it into what we call carboys. I don't know, these older gentlemen might know what a carboy is. It's a 15-gallon glass jug. It's set in a box, usually a wooden frame, and it's packed with Excelsior or straw or whatever around it to keep it from breaking. And he filled 100 of these bottles with that material and shipped it out of Ventura, California. He wanted to ship it around the corn back to Boston, where he'd been in the whaling business, and show these guys that he was making a product out here and how good he was doing it. Now, this is the year 1857. This is 2 years before Colonel Drake discovers oil in 1859 in Titusville, Pennsylvania. So we were actually producing oil, not from a hole in the ground, but from an oil seep, We were actually producing it 2 years before Colonel Drake ever discovered it. He was very successful at that. 50 of the bottles did make it around to Boston Harbor, but 50 of them didn't. And I'll digress just here for a second because it's an interesting story. 50 of them, for reasons we don't know, the ship's captain had it taken off the ship at the Isthmus of Panama and told him to pack it over the isthmus via whatever was available, and he would pick it up on the other side. Well, it never happened. He went all the way around the Horn for either reasons he didn't stop in there or whatever, but it wasn't until the Panama Canal was built, it wasn't until 1950 that they actually found old George Gilbert's in the jungles of Panama. They found his rest of his 50 bottles, and we actually got some samples out of it, and we discovered it. But anyway, the other 50 bottles did make it around the coast, and it came to the attention of a guy by the name of Benjamin Silliman. Now, Ben Silliman was a professor of noted status in that part of the world. He had helped Colonel Drake in the oil fields of Titusville, Pennsylvania, and had done a lot of remarkable things. Matter of fact, he was the first man to take stovepipe, drive it in the ground, so as they were drilling the hole wouldn't collapse, and he was very technically into that kind of thing and did a lot of things about drilling equipment and things of that nature. But came to his attention that, my gosh, there's oils on the platform here or on the dock in Boston Harbor. Where did it come from? And he sees George Gilbert's name. So, being the scientist that he was, and he had some projects out here in Nevada on gold and silver mining, he came out to the West Coast via wagon, if you will. Took several months to get across and came all the way out here, and he did the same thing that George Gilbert did. Come down the coast going to Ventura to see what George Gilbert was doing, and he found oil seeps and flowing oil in every creek and every place that he looked along the coastline. When he got down to George Gilbert's operation, he was so impressed that he decided that he would write a letter back to a guy by the name of Thomas Scott, who was the vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, but he was also the Secretary of War under Abraham Lincoln. And old Thomas Scott he trusted Mr. Silliman implicitly. He got some of his friends together and got enough money together to purchase 277,000 acres of land in what is now Ventura, Santa Barbara counties, on the say-so of Benjamin Silliman. But old Thomas Scott, he was a pretty shrewd business operator. He didn't just send the money, he sent a gentleman along with the money. And the gentleman that came with the money was a guy by the name of Thomas Bard, because he had also worked in the Titusville, Pennsylvania with Colonel Drake and knew a lot about the oil business. So he was sent out with the money to pick the spot, do the setup, and drill the drilling. But he also sent with him, around the Horn, a boiler and all the fixings, if you will, to go with what we now call a cable tool drilling rig, actually to bore a hole in the ground and look for oil. Well, he got here, he set up shop, and he drilled 6 holes, all of which were dry. And on the 7th hole, at star number 1, the year now, I haven't been giving you the years, and doggone it, I've been meaning to, because I'm going to give you a test on this when we get through. In the year 1866, they hit a 50-barrel oil well at 1,320 feet. Before that, and I'll digress for just a minute, they used what they called a spring pole. They just took a big limber log, if you will, maybe 25 feet off the ground. They would put a rope in one end and a heavy rock on the other, and the gentleman would put his leg in it and bounce it up and down. The rock would bounce on the ground, actually making holes, and that was called a spring pole. But this time, they actually physically, we can get into that when we get a little more time here. I'm trying to go through this fast. But up until that time, nobody had actually physically drilled for wells. Everybody had done it out of an oil seep in that part of the world. Well, the next big thing that came was in the year 1879, when Lyman Stewart and William Hardison came to this part of the world, and they came also out of the oil fields of Titusville, Pennsylvania, and they were going to make their fortune. They are the forerunners, if you will, of Unocal Corporation, which was formed on October the 17th, 1890. I'm sorry. But all right, now I want you to keep track of all that. Let's come back up here to Santa Maria, California, and see what's going on up here in this part of the world at the same time period. The earliest history that I can find that had anything to do with oil in this part of the country was in the year 1855. Now, where we're sitting right now, a large fire started someplace in what it was the pueblo of Guadalupe, California. Source of the ignition, I don't know. The funny thing about this fire was that it didn't go out. And a guy by the name of Ramon Rodriguez Ontiveros, which was the great-grandson of, well, he was just a little guy, but Juan Pacifico Ontiveros, then there was Abraham, and then Juan, okay. But Abraham and Juan Pacifico decided that they could see this fire from their ranch in Tepesquei Canyon, which was called Rancho Santa Maria, which was not where Santa Maria got its name, but that was what they called their ranch. And it had burnt for weeks after normally a fire should have gone out. It went over the Orcutt Hill, went down into the Los Alamos Valley, and kept going. You didn't run and put a fire out in those days. So he saddled up the old horse, came across the area from Tepesquei up into the Orcutt frontal plain, and lo and behold, he found that the ground was actually on fire. Natural gas seeping from a natural oil seep. Had been enough timber and wood and downfall and rotten materials and all trees and so forth that actually had put enough energy to ignite the ground, and the gases escaping from the ground were actually burning. Also, the oil seeps in that area were burning. And if you go up there today, there's a red rock pit up there, and it's all burnt almost red. Early residents of Orcutt, not early, the 1930s, 40s, 50s, all went up there and got these beautiful big rocks, clinkers, and you can probably still find them around this part of the town. But they were the surface rocks that were actually physically burnt. They're almost like glass. But it burnt in the depths of the ground and turned the ground almost a bright red like the Coke can there. And that is where old Ontiveros seen the fires burning, and we knew at that time that there was hydrocarbons in this part of the world. Okay. The next big thing that happened was at the corner of Broadway and Main in downtown Grangeville, then Center I'll get it out, Center City, and then Santa Maria. But at the corner of Broadway and Main in downtown Santa Maria came a guy by the name of M.P. Nicholson. Said, you guys here in agriculture have got wonderful land here. All you need is water. This dry land farming is not going to get it. Let me drill a water well for you, and I'll put you on the map. And at the corner of the Cook, the Thornburg, the Miller, and the Adams ranches, which all joined at that point downtown, he set up his drilling rig and proceeded to drill a well in the ground to get them water. Well, some of the people that I talked about a few minutes ago that were from the Santa Paula area now had about 2,000 to 4,000 barrels of oil production a day. The year is 1887. They're looking for new places to expand their development to. They come to the downtown Central City, and lo and behold, here's a guy with a drilling rig, everything they need to drill a well. So they go to him and say, what in the world are you working for these poor farmers for? They can't pay you anything. Come to work and we'll go out and we'll try to discover oil. Well, he did that and left the farmers high and dry and went to work for these people, which I call doodlebuggers, but they were doing the same thing. They weren't scientific in their approach. They just went alongside of an oil seep too and looked for oil. Well, lo and behold, the spot they picked was at Fugler's Point. I don't know how many of you know where Fugler's Point is, but it's out near the town of Sisquoc. They moved the rig out there. They started to drill. They drilled the hole, got down about 300 feet, got on a big rock, got in trouble. In one of his many trips back and forth to the blacksmith shop to make repairs and do those kinds of things, his horse kicked him in the head and he died of the injuries, and the well was never completed. But it was the very first attempt in this part of the world to drill for oil in the Santa Maria Valley, the year 1888 when that occurred. Okay, the next big thing that happened was probably about the time that Orcutt came to this part of the world. And I'll digress just for a second, but William Warren Orcutt, who this town is named after, was born in Dodge County, Minnesota, February the 14th, 1869. He came with, remember when I talked about Stewart and Hardison coming to this part of Caney? A few years after they got here, around the year 1881, they called for the Orcutt family to come out. Why? Because they were also considered experts in the oil drilling field, and they knew a lot about it. So he called the Orcutt family to come out, and along with them came William Warren Orcutt, the age about 12, 13 years old. He was a young, big, strapping kid, and his father worked in the oil fields, and William Warren Orcutt became what we called a gopher in the oil fields. He would fetch materials, he would fetch tools, he would bring lunches, he would do anything, hoe weeds, whatever was needed to be done. And old Lyman Stewart took such a shine to this young man, I'm digressing here again, that when he came of age, he put him to school at his expense, and he graduated with the first class of Stanford University in 1895. Now, his roommate, by the way, was Herbert Hoover, who later became President of the United States. But I had a lady come to my office here in Orcutt. The year was probably 1960. She was probably in her early to mid-90s. She claimed to be the sister of William Warren Orcutt, and after much conversation said that she had a grandchild, a daughter, and I don't know what her married name was, but her daughter was supposedly Lucille Ball of Stage and Screen. So, and she said that William Warren Orcutt never knew the family. Now, whether that's a true story or not, but I got it from the lips of the lady herself.